For decades, history's most elusive predators hid in plain sight, leaving behind crime scenes so brutal that platform guidelines strictly prohibit me from displaying the unedited reality of their violence. Yet, the absolute, undisputed facts of how these phantoms were finally hunted down 40 years later remain far more chilling than any photograph could ever convey. In December of 1979, the city of Cedar Rapids, Iowa was a quiet, tight-knit Midwestern community where residents rarely locked their doors and the threat of random, violent crime felt entirely foreign to the local population. 18-year-old Michelle Martinko was a typical, well-liked senior at Kennedy High School, deeply rooted in her community and widely known for her active involvement in the school choir and her bright, outgoing personality. On the evening of December 19, after attending a celebratory high school choir banquet, Michelle decided to drive her family's distinctive maroon and white 1972 Buick Electra to the newly opened Westdale Mall to purchase a new winter coat. The shopping center was bustling with holiday shoppers, providing a vibrant, festive, and ostensibly safe atmosphere that gave no indication of the unimaginable violence lurking in the freezing darkness of the exterior lots. Several friends and acquaintances reported seeing Michelle inside the mall around 8:00 p.m., where she was chatting amiably and browsing the storefronts, just like any other teenager preparing for the upcoming Christmas break. She was last seen alive walking toward the exit doors and into the expansive parking lot alone later that evening, her mind likely filled with mundane thoughts of her purchases and her upcoming graduation. The transition from the warmth of the crowded mall interior to the isolation of the snow-covered parking lot marked the final moments of a normal life for Michelle, as well as the beginning of a 40-year nightmare for her loved ones. Those who interacted with her during those final hours remembered her as remarkably happy, completely unaware that a patient predator was actively watching her movements from the shadows of the vehicle rows. This ordinary holiday errand in a safe Midwestern town was destined to become the catalyst for an agonizing investigation that would span generations and redefine the community's sense of security forever. Her family expected her home by midnight, but as the hours ticked away into the early morning of December 20, the silence from her end grew increasingly ominous, signaling that something had gone terribly wrong. When Michelle failed to return home after midnight, her worried parents contacted the Cedar Rapids Police Department, prompting an immediate search of the areas she was known to have visited that evening. At approximately 4:00 a.m. on December 20, 1979, a police officer patrolling the dark, nearly empty parking lot of the Westdale Mall spotted the Martinko family's Buick Electra parked in a remote section outside the Montgomery Ward department store. Upon approaching the vehicle and peering through the frost-covered windows, the officer made a gruesome discovery that shattered the peace of the entire city. Michelle was found slumped over the front seat of the vehicle, her body covered in blood from a frenzy of stab wounds to her face, neck, and chest. The interior of the heavy sedan was a horrific scene of violence, showing clear signs of a desperate, prolonged struggle for survival between the young girl and her attacker. Forensic pathologists later determined that Michelle had suffered multiple defensive wounds to her hands, proving she fought fiercely against her assailant, before ultimately bleeding to death from a fatal puncture to her heart. The killer had vanished into the freezing night, leaving behind no weapon and very few immediate clues as to their identity or motive. However, the ferocity of the attack suggested a level of personal rage. Yet there was no evidence of sexual assault or robbery, as her purse and newly purchased items remained untouched inside the car. The suddenness and sheer brutality of the crime sent shockwaves through Cedar Rapids, transforming a festive holiday season into a period of paralyzing fear and intense public scrutiny. Investigators quickly realized they were dealing with a calculated predator who had managed to execute a homicide in a public space and escape entirely unnoticed into the winter darkness. In the immediate aftermath of the murder, detectives launched a massive investigation, interviewing hundreds of shoppers, mall employees, and high school students in a desperate bid to piece together Michelle's final hours. Despite chasing thousands of leads, and constructing a psychological profile of the killer. The police continually found themselves at a complete standstill, as no clear suspects emerged from her social circle or the broader community. Decades slowly passed, and the case file grew thick with dead ends, eventually turning Michelle Martinko's murder into one of the most frustrating cold cases in Iowa history. Crucially, however, the original forensic team had meticulously preserved a bloodstain found on the book's dress and seat cover, which did not belong to Michelle, holding it in evidence for a future where technology might catch up to the crime. In 2006, investigators finally achieved a partial breakthrough when advanced forensic techniques allowed them to extract a clean, male DNA profile from that preserved blood stain, loading it into the National CODIS database. To their profound disappointment, the profile produced no matches, meaning the killer had likely avoided any subsequent felony arrests that would require a DNA submission over the intervening 27 years. The investigation remained frozen until 2018, when the Cedar Rapids Police Department partnered with Parabon Nanolabs to utilize the emerging field of investigative genetic genealogy. This cutting-edge process involved uploading the killer's DNA profile to public ancestry databases, allowing genealogists to construct a massive family tree based on distant genetic relatives. After months of painstaking archival research and tracking lineages through census data and public records, geneticists narrowed the search down to a specific cluster of the Burns family residing in rural Iowa. Investigators focused on 3 brothers who were alive and of age in 1979, systematically eliminating 2 of them through covert DNA collection, until only one viable suspect remained on their radar. The remaining suspect was Jerry Lynn Burns, a 63-year-old businessman and longtime resident of Manchester, Iowa, who had lived a completely unremarkable, law-abiding life just 40 miles away from the crime scene for nearly 40 years. By 20 lead-in, exactly 39 years to the day after Michelle was murdered, undercover detectives initiated a tense surveillance operation as Burns walked into a local Pizza Ranch restaurant for lunch. Detectives watched intently as Burns consumed his meal and used a clear plastic drinking straw, waiting patiently for the moment he discarded the item into a trash receptacle before moving in to retrieve it. The straw was immediately rushed to the State Crime Laboratory for hyper-urgent DNA analysis, where forensic scientists compared the genetic material from the saliva to the blood recovered from the Buick in 1979. The results provided an absolute undeniable match, revealing that the statistical probability of the DNA belonging to anyone other than Jerry Burns was 1 in 100 billion. Armed with this definitive scientific proof, investigators arrested Burns at his place of business and brought him into an interrogation room, where they presented him with the evidence of his 40-year-old crime. Throughout the intense questioning, Burns exhibited a chilling, bizarrely detached demeanor, showing no signs of panic or anger when confronted with photographs of the bloody crime scene. While he repeatedly claimed that he had absolutely no memory of committing the murder, he notably refrained from offering a vehement denial, instead stating that the DNA evidence was irrefutable and that he could not explain how his blood ended up in the car. His calm, almost robotic refusal to explain his actions only heightened the unsettling nature of the breakthrough, marking the definitive end of his decades of anonymity. Jerry Lynn Burns was officially charged with first-degree murder, and his highly anticipated trial commenced in February of 2020, drawing intense media coverage and the attention of a community that had waited 4 decades for justice. The prosecution's case rested heavily on the flawless DNA match, supplemented by forensic testimony detailing how the killer's blood was mixed with Michelle's during the violent struggle inside the vehicle. The defense attempted to argue that the DNA could have been contaminated or transferred through benign means, but the jury found the scientific evidence overwhelming and returned a guilty verdict after less than 3 hours of deliberation. On August 7, 2020, Burns was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, ensuring that he would spend the remainder of his natural life behind bars for the atrocity he committed as a young man. Although Michelle's parents had passed away years prior, without ever knowing who killed their daughter, her surviving sister and extended family expressed a profound sense of relief that the phantom who haunted their lives had finally been unmasked. The resolution of the Martinko case proved to the true crime community that time is no longer a shield for those who commit heinous acts, as science can bridge gaps that human memory cannot. Yet, while Jerry Burns hid his dark past under the guise of an ordinary, unassuming civilian businessman, other killers managed to evade suspicion by operating from within the very institutions designed to uphold the law, weaving themselves directly into the fabric of the justice system itself. In the early months of 1986, 29-year-old Sherry Rasmussen was living what appeared to be an exemplary and deeply fulfilling life in the vibrant city of Los Angeles, California. As a highly successful director of nursing at the critical care unit of Glendale Adventist Medical Center, Sherry was widely respected by her colleagues for her sharp intellect, her unwavering work ethic, and her profound compassion for her patients. Her personal life was equally flourishing. She had recently married John Rutten, a handsome mechanical engineer, and the newlyweds had just purchased a beautiful, sunny townhouse in the quiet neighborhood of Van Nuys. The couple was deeply intentional about building their future together, spending their evenings furnishing their new home, and planning for a family in an environment that felt entirely secure and insulated from the surrounding city's rising crime rates. Sherry's friends and family remembered her during this period as exceptionally happy, radiating the confidence of a young woman who had successfully balanced a demanding, high-profile medical career with a loving, stable marriage. Her daily routine was predictable and orderly, centered around her demanding shifts at the hospital and her devotion to her new husband. On the morning of February 24, 1986, Sherry decided to stay home from work to nurse a minor throat ailment, expecting a quiet day of rest in the comfort of her living room while her husband headed to his office. She locked the front door behind him, entirely unaware that the domestic sanctuary she had worked so hard to create had already been targeted by a deeply resentful predator who had been monitoring her life from a distance. The normalcy of that quiet Monday morning was destined to be violently shattered, launching an investigation that would expose the dark underbelly of obsession and institutional protection. When John Rutten returned to the Van Nuys townhouse later that evening, he expected to find his wife resting upstairs, but instead walked directly into a scene of unimaginable chaos and violence. The front door was unlocked, the couple's stereo equipment was stacked haphazardly near the entryway, and Sherry's silver BMW was completely missing from the driveway, suggesting a residential burglary caught in progress. As Rutten stepped further into the living room, he discovered Sherry's body lying on the floor, clad in her bathrobe, having suffered multiple close, range gunshot wounds and a severe beating. The state of the living room indicated that a catastrophic, desperate struggle for survival had taken place across the entire space. Furniture was overturned, a heavy ceramic vase had been smashed over Sherry's head, and there were deep cords of defensive wounds covering her arms and hands. Responding officers from the Los Angeles Police Department immediately secured the area, noting that the killer had fired 3 rounds from a .38 caliber handgun directly into Sherry's chest, with one shot being delivered through a quilted blanket to muffle the sound. Forensic investigators meticulously documented the scene, collecting a crucial piece of physical evidence that would prove decisive decades later: a clear, deep bite mark left by the assailant on Sherry's inner forearm, which was swabbed for saliva and preserved in the department's evidence locker. The lead detectives quickly established a narrative that the homicide was the work of 2 unidentified male burglars who had been interrupted by Rasmussen during the theft, a theory supported by the missing vehicle and the stacked electronic equipment. This burglary gone wrong hypothesis became the official stance of the investigators, despite several glaring inconsistencies that pointed toward a far more personal, targeted execution. From the very beginning of the investigation, Sherry's father, Nels Rasmussen, vehemently challenged the APDI's burglary theory, insisting that detectives look into a specific woman who had been terrorizing his daughter prior to the murder. Nels informed investigators that John Rutten's ex-girlfriend, A young and assertive LAPD patrol officer named Stephanie Lazarus had been deeply obsessed with Ruetten and fiercely resented his marriage to Sherry. According to the Rasmussen family, Lazarus had repeatedly showed up unannounced at Sherry's workplace and apartment, once confronting her directly to state that if she couldn't have John, no one else would. Despite Nels's repeated pleas for detectives to interview Lazarus and check her service weapon, the handling detectives dismissed his concerns, aggressively maintaining that a fellow officer could not possibly be involved in a random valley burglary. The case file grew completely cold as the years rolled into decades, and Stephanie Lazarus continued her upward trajectory within the ranks of the Los Angeles Police Department, eventually being promoted to the prestigious position of detective within the art theft detail. For 23 years, Lazarus walked the corridors of the same police headquarters where her victim's file gathered dust, entirely confident that the institutional bias of her peers had permanently shielded her from scrutiny. The turning point finally arrived in 2009, when the LAP's newly formed cold case unit selected the Rasmussen file for routine review, unconstrained by the internal politics and personal relationships that had compromised the original 1986 team. Investigators re-examined the physical evidence and quickly realized that the original burglary theory was entirely unviable, as burglars rarely engage in prolonged, intimate physical combat or leave behind distinct bite marks without stealing readily accessible valuables. The cold case detectives decided to bypass the outdated paper files and utilize modern technology to test the preserved DNA swab taken from the bite mark on Sherry's arm, expecting to find the profile of a career criminal. Instead, the laboratory returned a shocking result: the DNA belonged to a female, completely eliminating the long-held theory of two male burglars and pointing directly back to the obsessive ex-girlfriend Nels Rasmussen had warned them about decades prior. Knowing they were dealing with an active, highly trained detective who had daily access to police databases, the investigation team operated under conditions of absolute secrecy, utilizing code names and off-site meetings to avoid tipping off Lazarus. Undercover officers followed Lazarus during her off-duty hours, waiting patiently until she discarded a plastic cup from a local commercial establishment, which was immediately seized for urgent genetic comparison. The laboratory confirmed a definitive, indisputable match between the discarded cup and the 1986 bite mark, giving the department the agonizing confirmation that one of their own was a brutal killer. On June 5, 2009, Lazarus was approached by internal affairs detectives at her desk and asked to assist with a routine interview regarding an unrelated suspect in the building's basement jail facility, a ruse designed to disarm her without her weapon. Once inside the secure, monitored interrogation room, the detectives shifted the conversation toward her past relationship with John Ruetten, initiating a masterclass in psychological tension as Lazarus attempted to casually deflect their questions. As the interview progressed, her professional composure entirely disintegrated into defensive posturing and evasive maneuvers, culminating in her arrest when she realized the detectives already possessed her matching DNA profile. The trial of Stephanie Lazarus commenced in early 2012, captivating the public and sending tremors through the law enforcement community as prosecutors laid out a meticulous, fact-based timeline of obsession and murder. The prosecution presented the definitive DNA evidence from the bite mark, alongside records proving that Lazarus had reported her personal .38 caliber revolver stolen just weeks after the homicide, a weapon that perfectly matched the ballistics of the bullets pulled from Sherry's chest. John Ruetten took the stand, emotional and deeply remorseful, confirming that he had maintained a sporadic sexual relationship with Lazarus up until his engagement to Sherry, providing the clear motive of extreme romantic rejection and jealousy. The defense vigorously contested the chain of custody regarding the decades-old DNA sample, suggesting it had been compromised in storage, but the jury found the combination of forensic and circumstantial evidence overwhelming. On March 8, 2012, Lazarus was found guilty of first-degree murder and subsequently sentenced to 27 years to life in prison, bringing a devastating but necessary resolution to a family that had fought the system for nearly a generation. The conviction of Stephanie Lazarus exposed how easily a calculated predator could exploit institutional loyalty to evade justice, leaving an indelible stain on the history of California law enforcement. Yet, while Lazarus used her badge to conceal a singular act of passionate violence, other predators across the state were utilizing the sheer vastness of the geography to execute highly organized, multi-county campaigns of terror entirely undetected, moving like ghosts through unsuspecting communities. Throughout the early 1990s, the expansive, sun-drenched suburbs of Northern California were defined by a sense of modern prosperity, manicured landscapes, and a collective belief that their quiet residential developments were entirely insulated from urban violence. Families moved to counties like Sacramento, Solano, and Contra Costa specifically for the peaceful, community-oriented lifestyle, where neighbors knew one another and the idea of severe personal danger felt completely remote. Within these middle-class neighborhoods, residents routinely left their windows open during warm California nights, trusting in the inherent safety of their surroundings and the vigilance of local law enforcement agencies. This widespread tranquility, however, created the perfect hunting ground for a highly methodical and chillingly patient predator who viewed the structural predictability of suburban homes not as barriers, but as points of easy access. Unknown to the public, this individual spent his evenings conducting extensive surveillance on specific residences, cataloging the daily routines, vulnerabilities, and sleep schedules of the women who lived there. His preparation was meticulous, involving the mapping of escape routes through dark drainage canals, public parks, and unsecured backyard fences that crisscrossed the changing suburban terrain. The absolute normalcy of these quiet, safe neighborhoods provided the ultimate camouflage for an attacker who was preparing to launch a multi-year campaign of terror that would completely paralyze the region. This domestic peace was destined to be systematically dismantled by a phantom who understood exactly how to exploit the trust of an entire population, leaving a trail of shattered lives in his wake. The collective illusion of safety came to a sudden, terrifying end in 1991, when a series of incredibly violent and highly calculated home invasions began occurring across multiple northern counties, establishing a pattern that would baffle investigators for 15 years. Operating entirely under the cover of absolute darkness, the assailant, who would come to be known by law enforcement and the media as the Notorious rapist, would force his way into the homes of single women or women who were temporarily alone. He consistently wore a dark mask, carried a firearm, and utilized a flashlight to blind his victims, immediately stripping them of any ability to identify his facial features or physical anomalies. Once inside, he demonstrated an unsettlingly calm, commanding demeanor, frequently tying up his victims with cords or zip ties and explicitly threatening to execute them if they failed to comply with his precise demands. The attacks were not hurried, chaotic impulses. Instead, the perpetrator often remained inside the residences for hours, methodically assaulting the victims, ransacking their belongings, and sometimes even forcing them to bathe in an attempt to destroy physical evidence before he departed. He would then vanish silently into the night, leaving the victims bound and deeply traumatized in the supposed safety of their own beds. As the number of attacks grew, local police departments recognized a chillingly consistent modus operandi, but despite setting up specialized task forces and increasing nighttime patrols, they found absolutely no physical descriptions or eyewitness accounts capable of generating a viable suspect. For nearly 15 years, the Notorious rapist continued his elusive campaign, striking at irregular intervals that kept the authorities in a perpetual state of high alert and frustration. Detectives from numerous jurisdictions attempted to coordinate their efforts, cross-referencing lists of known sex offenders, searching through local employment records, and analyzing the precise geographical distribution of the crime scenes. Their efforts were repeatedly met with dead ends, as the perpetrator left behind virtually no traditional forensic footprints, no fingerprints, no dropped personal items, and no consistent vehicular descriptions that could link a specific individual to the scenes. The only tangible evidence investigators possessed was a collection of DNA samples recovered from the victims, which confirmed that a single, unidentified male was responsible for at least 10 separate assaults between 1991 and 2006. When this combined DNA profile was uploaded to the National CODIS database, it resulted in a complete lack of matches, meaning the perpetrator had managed to live a completely law-abiding life outside of his attacks, never being arrested for a felony that would require a state DNA submission. As the final recorded attack occurred in 2006, the trail went entirely cold, leaving a generation of investigators to retire with the agonizing knowledge that a prolific, highly organized predator was still walking free. The case files sat in storage for over a decade, viewed as an unsolvable mystery until the revolutionary emergence of open-source genetic tools offered a completely new avenue of investigation. In 2018, emboldened by the recent success of genetic genealogy and other high-profile cold cases, Sacramento visual file detectives partnered with forensic geneticists to re-examine the Notorious rapist's profile. The team uploaded the suspect's DNA to open-source ancestry databases, allowing them to bypass the traditional criminal justice system and map out the suspect's distant biological relatives through public family trees. After months of painstaking archival work, analyzing birth certificates, marriage licenses, and historical census data, the genealogical web converged tightly on a single, highly specific target. The data pointed directly to Roy Charles Waller, a 58-year-old man who had spent the last 26 years working as a highly respected safety specialist at the University of California, Berkeley. Waller was the absolute antithesis of what the public imagined a serial predator to be. He was an educated, unassuming professional whose daily job involved assessing workplace hazards and ensuring the safety of thousands of university personnel. Detectives immediately placed Waller under intense, round-the-clock surveillance, tracking his movements from his home in Benicia to his university office in search of a viable biological sample. The surveillance team successfully recovered a discarded plastic drinking cup and a piece of trash that Waller had deposited in a public receptacle. Rushing the items to the California Department of Justice Laboratory for hyper-urgent testing, the laboratory results left absolutely no room for ambiguity, confirming that the DNA from the Berkeley safety specialist perfectly matched the genetic profile of the Notorious rapist. Roy Charles Waller was arrested without incident on September 20, 2018, as he arrived at work on the UC Berkeley campus, bringing a sudden and shocking end to his 27 years of absolute anonymity. His trial, which took place in late 2020, was a harrowing presentation of clinical forensic evidence and powerful victim testimony, as several survivors took the stand to face the man who had altered the course of their lives decades prior. The prosecution presented an airtight case, utilizing advanced statistical data to show that the probability of the DNA belonging to anyone other than Waller was 1 in several quintillion, completely dismantling any argument of coincidence or lab contamination. Furthermore, a search of Waller's private property revealed a hidden collection of items that aligned perfectly with the trophies and tools described by the victims during the original 1990s investigations. On November 18, 2020, the jury found Waller guilty on 46 separate felony counts, including rape, sodomy, and kidnapping, representing the totality of his verified crimes across multiple decades. During his sentencing hearing on December 18, 2020, the judge handed down a historic and staggering sentence of 897 years in state prison, ensuring that Waller would spend the remainder of his natural life behind bars. The resolution of the Notorious rapist case provided an immense sense of validation for the survivors, proving that the passage of decades does nothing to diminish the scientific certainty of guilt. Yet, while Waller utilized the vast geography of Northern California to conceal his highly predatory routine, other elusive killers were utilizing the remote interstate corridors of the Pacific Northwest to snatch victims across state lines, leaving bodies in completely different jurisdictions to permanently confound law enforcement. In November of 1987, the scenic and heavily forested landscape of the Pacific Northwest was experiencing a typical, mist-shrouded autumn, attracting travelers with its serene highways and quiet, isolated coastal towns. Among those journeying through the region were 20 18-year-old Jay Cook, and his 18-year-old girlfriend, Tanya Van Cuylenborg, a young, vibrant couple from Saanich, British Columbia. The two had embarked on what was supposed to be a brief, routine road trip to Seattle, Washington, driving a distinctive copper-colored 1977 Ford Fairmont wagon to pick up some specialized furnace parts for Jay's father's business. Both Jay and Tanya were deeply responsible individuals, widely known within their close-knit Canadian community for their gentle demeanors, reliable natures, and deep devotion to their respective families. Tanya was an avid photographer who documented every step of their journey, capturing the ordinary, picturesque beauty of the ferry crossings and coastal roads on her camera. Completely insulated from any thoughts of danger, their itinerary was simple and predictable, involving a ferry ride from Victoria to Port Angeles, followed by a scenic drive down the Olympic Peninsula toward their final destination in King County. Family members remembered them as exceptionally happy and excited for this independent venture, sending them off with the expectation of a quick return within a few days. The sheer normalcy of this youthful road trip, set against the backdrop of quiet marine highways and towering evergreen forests, gave absolutely no indication that the couple was driving directly into the path of an incredibly calculated and cold-blooded predator. The sense of security surrounding the couple's trip evaporated entirely when they failed to return to Vancouver Island as scheduled, prompting their frantic families to officially report them missing on November 20, 1987. The investigation took a dark and devastating turn just 4 days later, on November 24, when a utility worker discovered Tanya Van Cuylenborg's body ditched in a remote, brush-covered ditch near Alger, Washington, in Skagit County. Forensic pathologists determined that Tanya had been brutally sexually assaulted, bound with unique plastic zip ties, and executed with a single, close-range gunshot wound to the back of her head. The absolute horror of the case escalated on November 26, when Jay Cook's body was located miles away, discarded underneath a bridge near the Snoqualmie River in Snohomish County, completely separate from his girlfriend. Jay had been beaten, bound with the same distinct brand of plastic zip ties, and violently strangled with twine and rocks, demonstrating an intense level of physical savagery. The couple's copper Ford Fairmont wagon was subsequently located abandoned in a parking lot in downtown Bellingham, containing Tanya's camera equipment and a collection of unused zip ties that matched the bindings used on both victims. Local sheriff's departments across multiple Washington counties immediately joined forces, recognizing that they were dealing with a highly mobile, deeply sadistic killer who possessed an intimate knowledge of the region's remote backroads. Despite collecting a wealth of physical evidence, including a clean male DNA profile from Tanya's body, the multi-jurisdictional task force found themselves completely at a loss for a suspect, as the physical trail ended abruptly at the abandoned station wagon. For over 3 decades, the double homicide of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg remained one of the most haunting and deeply frustrating cold cases in the history of Washington state. Detectives pursued thousands of leads across 2 countries, interviewing transient workers, examining regional gas station receipts, and investigating dozens of registered sex offenders who frequented the interstate corridors. The investigation was further complicated by a series of taunting, anonymous letters sent to the victims, grieving families from a writer claiming to be the killer, which detailed intimate aspects of the crime scenes and psychological torment. Every single lead ultimately resulted in a dead end, and as the decades marched on, the case file grew massive, while the physical evidence sat frozen inside Snohomish County's evidence vault. The male DNA profile recovered from the 1987 crime scene was repeatedly run through the National CODIS database, but it never generated a single match, indicating the killer had avoided any felony arrests that would require a state DNA submission. The breakthrough that would completely redefine the investigation did not emerge from traditional police work, but from the revolutionary implementation of investigative genetic genealogy in early 2018. Parabon Nanolabs uploaded the killer's preserved DNA profile to public, open-source ancestry databases, allowing genealogists to construct an expansive familial web based on distant genetic cousins. After months of tracking public records, obituary files, and historical marriage data, The genealogical search converged with absolute certainty on a single, specific family line residing in the Puget Sound area. The genealogical data narrowed the pool of potential suspects down to one specific individual, William Earl Talbot II, a 55-year-old commercial truck driver who was 24 at the time of the murders and lived just miles from where Jay Cook's body was discovered. Talbot had lived a completely unremarkable, blue-collar life in the decades following the crime, maintaining a clean criminal record and working quietly within the transportation industry without ever drawing law enforcement's eye. Undercover detectives immediately initiated a discreet, high-stakes surveillance operation, shadowing Talbot along his daily driving routes to secure a viable biological sample without alerting him to their presence. The breakthrough occurred in May of 2018, when detectives observed Talbot parked in his truck, watching intently as he used a plastic coffee cup and a blue shop towel before discarding them into a public trash receptacle. The items were immediately seized by the surveillance team and rushed to the Washington State Patrol Crime Laboratory for hyper-urgent, definitive genetic sequencing. The results provided an absolute undeniable match, confirming that the DNA from the truck driver's discarded coffee cup perfectly mirrored the genetic profile found on Tanya Van Kallenborg's body 31 years prior. William Earl Talbot II was arrested on May 17, 2018, and his subsequent trial in June of 2019 marked a historic milestone, becoming the first case in global legal history involving investigative genetic genealogy to go before a jury trial. The prosecution presented an airtight, fact-based narrative, utilizing precise forensic mapping to connect Talbot's historical residence to the remote dump sites and relying heavily on the definitive DNA evidence. The defense tried to argue that the presence of DNA did not explicitly prove murder, but the jury was utterly unconvinced, returning a verdict of guilty on 2 counts of first-degree murder after less than 3 days of deliberation. On July 24, 2019, Talbot was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, bringing a monumental sense of justice to the Cook and Van Kallenborg families who had carried their grief for a generation. The resolution of this iconic Pacific Northwest cold case demonstrated to the world that a killer's decades of absolute anonymity can be completely dismantled by a single discarded item in a public family tree. Yet, while Talbot's crimes were defined by their geographic isolation and sudden violence, another predator in California was operating on a vastly larger scale, executing hundreds of break-ins and murders that would completely reshape the landscape of American criminal justice. Throughout the mid to late 1970s, the sun-drenched, middle-class suburbs of California were characterized by a deep sense of post-war optimism, expanding residential developments, and a highly relaxed approach to domestic security. In communities spanning from the Central Valley to the coastal enclaves of Orange County, families lived a remarkably open lifestyle, routinely leaving their back doors unlocked, their windows unlatched to catch the evening breeze, and their blinds drawn open. Children played in the suburban cul-de-sacs until dusk, and the concept of a highly organized, predatory home invader was entirely absent from the public consciousness. Within this tranquil, unsuspecting environment, residents took immense pride in the predictability and safety of their neighborhoods, never imagining that the architectural uniformity of their single-story ranch homes was being meticulously studied by a shadow. Unknown to these communities, an incredibly patient and highly disciplined predator was spending his nights moving silently through the dark utility easements, public parks, and canal banks that bordered their properties. He spent countless hours conducting precise surveillance on specific households, cataloging the exact floor plans, the structural access points, the work schedules of husbands, and the sleeping arrangements of women. This widespread, trusting normalcy provided the ultimate tactical camouflage for an offender who was actively preparing to launch an unprecedented, multi-year campaign of terror. This domestic peace was destined to be systematically eradicated by a phantom who understood exactly how to exploit the vulnerability of a suburban population, permanently altering the collective psyche of the entire state. The collective illusion of safety shattered completely as a wave of incredibly intrusive and highly calculated home invasions began occurring across Sacramento County, establishing a pattern of terrifying escalation. Operating under the absolute cover of darkness, the assailant, who would initially be dubbed the East Area Rapist, would force his way into residences through unlocked sliding glass doors or pried windows, moving with a chillingly fluid, predatory confidence. He consistently wore a dark ski mask, carried a loaded firearm, and utilized a high-intensity flashlight to blind his victims, immediately stripping them of any ability to identify his facial features or physical anomalies. Once inside, he demonstrated an unsettlingly calm, commanding demeanor, frequently targeting couples by forcing the woman to tie up her husband with shoelaces or towels before placing a stack of dishes on the man's back. The perpetrator would explicitly threaten to execute the entire household if he heard the dishes rattle, creating a state of absolute psychological paralysis while he methodically assaulted the woman in an adjacent room. He was never hurried. Instead, he would often remain inside the residences for hours, pacing through the hallways, consuming food from the family's refrigerator, and deliberately ransacking their personal belongings to search for specific trophies. He would then vanish silently into the suburban night, leaving his victims physically bound and deeply traumatized in the supposed safety of their own beds. As the number of attacks grew exponentially, local police departments recognized a chillingly consistent modus operandi, but despite massive law enforcement mobilizations, they found absolutely no viable leads. As the late 1970s transitioned into the early 1980s, the predator completely shifted his geographical focus, moving his operation to Southern California and escalating his violence from serial sexual assault to cold-blooded, execution-style homicide. In this new phase, the killer, redubbed by the media as the original Night Stalker, targeted couples in affluent neighborhoods, breaking into their homes and brutally bludgeoning or shooting them to death in their beds. The sheer ferocity of these attacks, coupled with the killer's uncanny ability to bypass security systems and vanish without leaving a single trace, plunged the entire state into a condition of absolute, paralyzing paranoia. Gun sales soared, residents invested heavily in deadbolts and attack dogs, and neighbors began viewing one another with deep suspicion as the body count steadily rose to 12 confirmed murders. Investigators from dozens of separate jurisdictions attempted to coordinate their efforts, analyzing tire tracks, examining regional burglary reports, and cross-referencing thousands of potential suspects, but their efforts were repeatedly met with total failure. The perpetrator left behind virtually no traditional forensic footprints, no fingerprints, no dropped identification, and no consistent vehicular descriptions that could link a specific individual to the scenes. The only tangible, unifying evidence investigators possessed was a collection of biological samples recovered from the crime scenes, which eventually confirmed that a single, unidentified male was responsible for the vast network of crimes. When this combined DNA profile was uploaded to the National CODIS database in the late 1990s, it resulted in a complete lack of matches, meaning the killer had managed to live a completely law-abiding life outside of his attacks. The investigation remained frozen for over 3 decades, viewed as an entirely unsolvable mystery that haunted generations of detectives who retired with the agonizing knowledge that a prolific serial killer was still walking free. The turning point finally arrived in early 2018, when a specialized task force led by the Sacramento County District Attorney's Office partnered with innovative geneticists to utilize the emerging field of investigative genetic genealogy. The team uploaded the killer's preserved DNA profile to public, open-source ancestry databases, allowing them to bypass the traditional criminal justice system and map out the suspect's distant biological relatives through public family trees. After months of painstaking archival work, analyzing birth certificates, marriage licenses, and historical military records, the genealogical web converged tightly on a single, highly specific target. The data pointed directly to Joseph James D'Angelo, a 72-year-old grandfather and retired truck mechanic living quietly in the suburban neighborhood of Citrus Heights, California. Shockingly, historical records revealed that D'Angelo had served as a sworn police officer in both Exeter and Auburn, during the exact years the early attacks occurred, meaning he had utilized his professional law enforcement training to execute his crimes and evade detection. Detectives immediately placed D'Angelo under intense, round-the-clock surveillance, tracking his movements to secure a viable biological sample without alerting him to their presence. The surveillance team successfully recovered a discarded item that D'Angelo had deposited in a public trash receptacle, rushing it to the crime laboratory for hyper-urgent testing, which confirmed a definitive, indisputable match. Joseph James D'Angelo was arrested outside his home on April 24, 2018, bringing a sudden and monumental end to his 40-year reign of absolute anonymity and terror. To avoid the death penalty, D'Angelo entered into a comprehensive plea agreement, and on June 29, 2020, he sat in a massive university ballroom, converted into a courtroom, to face the totality of his horrific legacy. In a chillingly clinical proceeding, prosecutors read the exhaustive details of 13 murders and dozens of kidnappings, with D'Angelo repeatedly rasping the word "guilty" into a microphone. Dozens of aging survivors and victims' family members took the stand over several days, delivering incredibly powerful victim impact statements that detailed the lifelong trauma inflicted by the man sitting bound in a wheelchair before them. On August 21, 2020, D'Angelo was officially sentenced to multiple consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole, ensuring that he would spend the remainder of his natural life behind bars. The resolution of the Golden State Killer case represented the most significant triumph in the history of investigative genetic genealogy, proving that even the most calculated and elusive phantoms cannot outrun the march of scientific progress. Yet, while D'Angelo utilized his professional law enforcement background to orchestrate a vast, multi-county campaign of violence, other predators managed to conceal their atrocities by operating within the tight confines of tiny, rural communities, living for decades as ordinary, blue-collar neighbors to the very families they destroyed. In late November of 1989, the tiny rural logging community of Acme, Washington was experiencing a cold, mist-shrouded autumn, with residents focused entirely on upcoming Thanksgiving holiday celebrations with their families. Nestled deep within Whatcom County, this close-knit valley town was the absolute epitome of rural safety, an environment where multi-generational families lived on expansive farmsteads and children routinely roamed the backroads without supervision. 18-year-old Mandy Stavik was a remarkably talented, popular graduate of Mount Baker High School, widely known for her exceptional academic achievements, her athletic prowess, and her vibrant, warm personality. Having recently completed her first quarter at Central Washington University, Mandy was back home for the holiday break, eagerly looking forward to reuniting with her childhood friends and spending time in the quiet valley she loved. On the afternoon of November 24, 1989, she decided to go for a routine 3-mile jog along Strand Road, a quiet, gravel lane that wound past local pastures and thick evergreen woods toward the Nooksack River. She left her family home accompanied only by her brother's German Shepherd, Kira, moving with the absolute confidence of a young woman who had traversed these rural roads her entire life without ever encountering a threat. Neighbors saw her jogging along the roadside, her mind likely filled with thoughts of college life and holiday plans, completely insulated from any concept of personal danger. The transition from the safety of her family's kitchen to the isolation of the rural roadway marked the final moments of normalcy for Mandy, as well as the beginning of a 30-year hunt for a hidden monster. The sense of peace enveloping the Stavik household disintegrated completely later that afternoon when the German Shepherd returned to the family property alone, her agitated behavior signaling that something had gone terribly wrong on the road. Mandy's frantic mother immediately contacted neighbors and local law enforcement, sparking a massive, desperate search of the dense brush and riverbanks that lined her routine jogging route. The investigation took a dark and devastating turn 3 days later, on November 27, 1989, when searchers discovered Mandy's completely unclothed body floating in the freezing waters of the Nooksack River, roughly 3.5 miles from her home. Forensic pathologists determined that the young code had been brutally sexually assaulted, struck on the head, and ultimately held underwater until she drowned, proving she had been the victim of a calculated, opportunistic abduction. The absolute horror of the crime sent shockwaves through the isolated valley, transforming the quiet farming community into a place of intense paranoia, where residents suddenly locked their doors and purchased firearms for defense. Forensic investigators meticulously processed Mandy's body, collecting a crucial piece of physical evidence that would prove decisive decades later: a clean, viable male DNA profile from the assailant, which was carefully preserved in the state's evidence repository. The handling detectives launched an exhaustive investigation, focusing on hundreds of local men, transient workers, and delivery drivers who were known to be in the area on that specific Friday afternoon. Despite constructing a detailed timeline of Mandy's final hours and interviewing virtually every resident within a 10-mile radius, the police found themselves at a complete standstill as the killer had vanished into the rural landscape without leaving behind a single witness or physical clue. For over 2 decades, the murder of Mandy Stavik remained an open, agonizing wound for the residents of Whatcom County, and a deeply frustrating cold case for generations of local sheriffs. Investigators refused to let the file gather dust, systematically interviewing new residents, checking alibis, and utilizing the National CODIS database to run the killer's DNA profile against convicted felons across the United States. To their profound disappointment, the automated system never generated a single match, indicating that the perpetrator had managed to live a completely law-abiding life outside of this singular atrocity, never being arrested for a crime that required a state DNA submission. In the early 2010s, a dedicated cold case detective decided to implement a highly ambitious strategy, systematically contacting hundreds of men who had lived in the Acme area in 1989 and requesting voluntary DNA swabs to eliminate them from the suspect pool. While the vast majority of current and former residents eagerly complied to help clear their names and find justice for Mandy, one long-time resident consistently evaded the requests, drawing the quiet attention of investigators. Timothy Forrest Bass, a delivery truck driver for a local commercial bakery who lived just a short distance from the Stavik home in 1989, repeatedly refused to provide a voluntary sample, invoking his constitutional rights and forcing detectives to seek an alternative, entirely legal method of obtaining his genetic blueprint. The breakthrough in the investigation did not come from a forced police warrant, but from the extraordinary civic courage of a local citizen who recognized the suspicious behavior of her coworker. In 2013, a female supervisor at the Franz Bakery Distribution Center, where Bass had worked quietly as a delivery driver for years, became aware that the sheriff's department was highly interested in obtaining Bass's DNA. Recognizing his pattern of defensive behavior whenever the Stavik case was mentioned, and driven by a personal desire to see the historic murder resolved, she decided to act as an independent agent of justice. On an ordinary workday, she watched intently as Bass consumed a beverage from a plastic cup and a plastic Coca-Cola can during his shift, waiting patiently until he discarded the items into a communal lunchroom trash receptacle. She immediately retrieved the discarded items, placed them in a clean bag, and contacted detectives, who rushed the evidence to the Washington State Patrol Crime Laboratory for hyper-urgent genetic sequencing. The laboratory analysis delivered a stunning, definitive result, confirming that the DNA from the delivery driver's discarded soda can perfectly mirror the genetic profile recovered from Mandy Stavik's body 24 years prior. The statistical probability of the DNA belonging to anyone other than Timothy Bass was calculated at 1 in several quadrillion, giving prosecutors the absolute scientific certainty required to make an arrest. Timothy Forrest Bass was arrested on December 12, 2017, as he arrived at work, bringing a sudden and shocking end to his 28 years of absolute anonymity within the very community he terrorized. His highly anticipated trial commenced in May of 2019, drawing intense media coverage and the presence of Mandy's aging mother, who had waited nearly 3 decades to look her daughter's killer in the eye. The prosecution presented an airtight, fact-based narrative, relying heavily on the definitive forensic DNA match and demonstrating that Bass's delivery routes and residence perfectly aligned with the logistics of the abduction. and the river dump site. The defense attempted to argue that the sexual encounter was consensual, a claim that was completely dismantled by forensic experts who detailed the severe pre-mortem injuries to Mandy's head and body, which were entirely inconsistent with any consensual act. On May 24, 2019, the jury returned a verdict of guilty on all counts, including first-degree murder, first-degree kidnapping, and first-degree rape. Bass was subsequently sentenced to nearly 27 years in prison, the maximum sentence allowed under the state's 1989 sentencing guidelines, ensuring he would spend decades behind bars for the life he stole. The resolution of the Stavik case proved that a killer's long-term survival in a small town is entirely dependent on absolute silence, a shield that can be shattered by a single piece of discarded trash and a vigilant neighbor. Yet, while Bass hid his dark past behind the routine schedule of a local delivery driver, other predators actively used their anonymity to engage in cruel, psychological warfare, sending taunting letters to the police and families while continuing to watch their victims from the shadows. In April of 1988, the industrial city of Fort Wayne, Indiana was experiencing a typical Midwestern spring, with families taking advantage of the warming weather to gather in local parks and residential neighborhoods. Among the children enjoying the outdoor freedom was 8-year-old April Mary Tinsley, a bright, charismatic second grader who was widely known for her sweet disposition, her love of animals, and her vibrant imagination. April was a deeply loved child rooted in a modest, hardworking family that trusted implicitly in the inherent safety of their neighborhood streets, where children routinely walked to one another's houses without a second thought. On the afternoon of April 1, 1988, Good Friday, April asked her mother for permission to walk a few blocks to a friend's house to look for an umbrella she had misplaced. Her mother agreed, expecting her back within the hour for dinner, and watched as her young daughter walked down the sidewalk, her mind likely filled with innocent childhood, thoughts of playtime, and the upcoming Easter holiday. The short walk along Hoagland Avenue was a path April had taken countless times, providing a deceptive sense of familiarity that gave absolutely no indication of the extreme danger lingering near the street corners. The sudden transition from the safety of her neighborhood sidewalks to the vehicle of a patient, calculated predator marked the final moments of normalcy for April, as well as the beginning of a 30-year nightmare for the entire city. The sense of security surrounding the Tinsley family evaporated entirely when April failed to return home by dinner time, prompting her frantic parents to launch an immediate search of the surrounding streets before contacting the Fort Wayne Police Department. The worst fears of the community were realized 3 days later, on April 4, 1988, when a motorist spotted April's partially clothed body discarded in a water-filled ditch in a remote area of rural DeKalb County, roughly 30 miles north of Fort Wayne. Forensic pathologists determined that the young girl had been brutally sexually assaulted and suffocated to death, with her body showing clear signs of pre-mortem trauma that indicated a violent struggle against her captor. The sheer brutality of the homicide sent shockwaves through northeastern Indiana, transforming the city of Fort Wayne into a place of intense public fear and paranoia, where parents refused to let their children play outside unattended. Forensic investigators carefully processed the body, collecting a clean, viable male DNA profile from the crime scene, which was meticulously preserved in the state's evidence repository for a future where technology might catch up to the crime. Despite mobilizing a massive multi-agency task force, interviewing hundreds of local residents, and chasing thousands of leads, the police found themselves completely at a loss for a suspect, as the killer had managed to execute the abduction and disposal without leaving behind a single immediate witness. The investigation took a deeply disturbing turn a little over 2 years later, in May of 1990, when a local resident discovered a horrifying, handwritten note scratched onto a barn door in rural Allen County, marking the beginning of a cruel campaign of psychological torment. The author explicitly claimed responsibility for April's murder, stating that he was actively watching the children of Fort Wayne and intended to strike again, a claim that ballistics and forensic analysis tied directly back to the active investigation. The psychological warfare escalated dramatically in June of 2004, when the killer placed several plastic baggies on young girls' bicycles across Fort Wayne, containing taunting messages, used condoms, and photographs of a man's lower body. One of the notes read with chilling arrogance, "I am the same man who killed April Tinsley back in 1988, and I will kill again if the police do not catch me soon." Despite this sudden influx of new physical evidence and a direct taunt to the authorities, traditional forensic testing failed to produce a match within the National CODIS database, meaning the perpetrator had avoided any subsequent felony arrests that would require a state DNA submission. The case file grew massive with dead ends, remaining a deeply frustrating cold case, until the historic implementation of investigative genetic genealogy in early 2018 completely altered the landscape of the hunt. The Fort Wayne Police Department partnered with innovative geneticists at Suburban Nanolabs, who uploaded the killer's preserved 1988 DNA profile to public open-source ancestry databases to map out his distant biological relatives. After months of painstaking archival work, tracking public marriage licenses, obituary files, and historical census data, the genealogical search converged with absolute certainty on a single, specific family line. The genetic data narrowed the pool of potential suspects down to two brothers, leading detectives straight to John D. Miller, a 59-year-old resident of rural Grable, Indiana, who was 29 at the time of April's murder. Miller had lived a completely unremarkable, isolated life in the decades following the crime, residing in a small trailer and working quietly, without ever drawing the attention of local law enforcement or his neighbors. Undercover detectives immediately initiated a discreet surveillance operation, shadowing Miller to secure a viable biological sample without alerting him to their presence. The breakthrough occurred when detectives observed Miller discard a bag of trash outside his residence, which was immediately seized by the team and rushed to the Indiana State Police Laboratory for urgent testing. The laboratory analysis delivered a definitive, indisputable match, confirming that the DNA from the discarded trash perfectly mirrored the genetic profile recovered from April Tinsley's body 30 years prior. On July 15, 2018, investigators approached John D. Miller at his residence and requested that he accompany them to the police station for a formal interview regarding the 1988 homicide. Once inside the secure interrogation room, when confronted with the absolute reality of the matching DNA evidence, Miller's decades of denial completely collapsed, and he delivered a cold, emotionless confession detailing how he had abducted April from the street and suffocated her in his vehicle. On December 7, 2018, Miller officially pled guilty to child molesting and murder, sitting impassively in the courtroom as April's surviving family members delivered powerful victim impact statements regarding the lifelong trauma he had inflicted. The judge handed down the maximum possible sentence of 80 years in prison, ensuring that Miller would spend the remainder of his natural life behind bars for the atrocity he committed as a young man. The resolution of the April Tinsley case provided an immense sense of closure to the city of Fort Wayne, proving that the passage of decades does nothing to diminish the scientific certainty of guilt or the relentless drive of investigators. Yet, while Miller used psychological taunts on bicycle handlebars to torment a local community, other killers managed to sustain a decades-long campaign of media manipulation and public terror on a national scale, using complex code names to guarantee their historical infamy. In January of 1974, the quiet Midwestern city of Wichita, Kansas, was a deeply traditional and community-oriented environment where residents felt entirely secure within their suburban neighborhoods. Families routinely left their doors unlocked, children walked to local schools unescorted, and the concept of extreme personal danger inside one's own home was completely foreign to the public consciousness. Within this peaceful setting, 38-year-old Joseph Odero, a retired U.S. Army officer, and his 34-year-old wife Julie were focused entirely on building a stable, prosperous life for their 5 children. The Otero household on North Edgemoor Street was a bustling, happy domestic space, characterized by the predictable, comforting routines of school schedules, family dinners, and neighborhood friendships. On the morning of January 15, 1974, Joseph and Julie were home alongside their 11-year-old son Josephine and 9-year-old son Joseph Jr., preparing for an ordinary winter day, while the older children headed to school. The absolute normalcy of that quiet Tuesday morning gave no indication that the residents had been targeted by a highly methodical and cold-blooded predator who had been monitoring the family's movements from a distance. The sudden transition from the warmth of family life to a state of absolute terror marked the final moments of normalcy for the Otero family, as well as the beginning of a 30-year campaign of public fear that would permanently alter the history of Kansas. The illusion of safety shattered completely later that afternoon when the older Otero children returned home from school and discovered a scene of unimaginable horror inside the residence. All 4 family members, Joseph, Julie, Josephine, and Joseph Jr., had been bound with cords and brutally executed through slow, systematic strangulation in separate rooms of the house. The killer had vanished into the winter landscape, leaving behind virtually no traditional forensic footprints, such as fingerprints or a murder weapon, that could immediately identify him to local authorities. In October of 1974, the investigation took a deeply disturbing turn when a local resident discovered a letter hidden inside an engineering textbook at the Wichita Public Library, marking the beginning of a cruel campaign of media manipulation. In the typed note, the author explicitly claimed responsibility for the Otero murders, introducing himself to the world by a chilling acronym that detailed his specific, sadistic methodology BTK, which stood for bind, torture, kill. Over the next decade, this phantom orchestrated a wave of terror across Wichita, breaking into the homes of unsuspecting women, cutting telephone lines, and executing a total of 10 verified victims, while continuously sending taunting letters and poems to local news stations. Despite massive law enforcement mobilizations and the creation of specialized ghost hunting task forces, investigators continually found themselves at a total standstill, as the killer managed to live an entirely law-abiding life outside of his attacks. By the mid-1980s, the BTK killer appeared to go completely dormant, leaving the public and generations of frustrated detectives to wonder if the predator had died, moved away, or been imprisoned for an unrelated offense. For nearly 20 years, the case sat frozen in the Wichita Police Department's evidence vault, viewed as one of the most frustrating and elusive cold mysteries in the history of American criminal justice. Crucially, however, forensic investigators had carefully preserved semen samples recovered from the 1974 Otero crime scene, which were eventually loaded into the National CODIS database in the late 1990s. To their profound disappointment, the profile produced no matches, meaning the killer had avoided any subsequent felony arrests that would require a state DNA submission over the intervening decades. The frozen investigation was completely reignited in March of 2004, when the local newspaper received a mysterious letter bearing the return address of the 1974 Otero residents, proving with absolute certainty that the BTK killer was still alive and seeking public attention. Driven by an insatiable, narcissistic desire for historical infamy, the killer began a frequent, high-stakes correspondence with detectives, sending packages containing trophies from his past victims, complex puzzles, and direct questions regarding the capabilities of modern forensic science. The fatal turning point in the investigation occurred in early 2005, when the killer's overconfidence and technological ignorance blinded him to the digital footprints left by modern computer operating systems. In one of his letters to the police, BTK asked if it would be safe for him to communicate by sending a floppy disk to a local news station without the authorities being able to track his physical location. Detectives responded through a coded classified newspaper ad, falsely assuring him that a floppy disk could not be traced, prompting the killer to deliver a purple 1.44 megabyte disk to a local television station in February of 2005. Computer forensic specialists immediately analyzed the disk's deleted metadata, uncovering a hidden electronic file trace that pointed directly to the Christ Lutheran Church in Park City, Kansas, and specifically to a user named Dennis. A quick cross-reference of public records revealed that the church's congregation president was Dennis Lynn Rader, a 59-year-old local compliance officer, married father of two, and former Boy Scout leader who had lived a quiet, unremarkable life in the suburbs for decades. Knowing they needed definitive physical proof before making an arrest, investigators executed a covert, highly legal warrant to obtain a medical DNA sample from Rader's adult daughter, which had been stored at a university clinic. The laboratory analysis delivered a stunning definitive match, proving that the familial DNA from the clinic sample perfectly mirrored the genetic profile recovered from the 1974 Otero crime scene. Dennis Lynn Rader was arrested without incident on February 25, 2005, while driving near his suburban home, bringing a sudden and monumental end to his 30-year reign of absolute anonymity and terror. On June 27, 2005, Rader stood before a packed courtroom and delivered a chillingly clinical, emotionless confession that stunned the nation, detailing the precise logistics of all 10 murders with the detached demeanor of an academic giving a lecture. He explained how he had selected his victims, referred to his crimes as projects, and expressed absolutely no remorse for the immense suffering he had inflicted upon the community and his own blindsided family. On August 18, 2005, Rader was sentenced to 10 consecutive life terms in prison, representing the absolute maximum penalty allowed under Kansas law at the time his crimes were committed, as the state had no death penalty in effect during those years. The resolution of the BTK case demonstrated to the world that a serial killer's intense narcissism can ultimately become his undoing, turning his own desire for attention into the catalyst for his permanent downfall. Yet, while Rader's conviction relied on the high-tech extraction of hidden computer metadata, other historic investigations were severely compromised by flawed human witness statements, resulting in innocent individuals spending decades behind bars, while the true predator lived entirely unbothered, just feet from the original crime scene. In June of 1996, the quiet community of Idaho Falls, Idaho, was a peaceful, family-oriented city where residents felt entirely secure within their suburban developments. 18-year-old Angie Dodge was a bright, independent young woman who had recently moved into her very first apartment on I Street, eager to begin her adult life. Angie was deeply loved by her family and friends, widely known for her infectious laugh, her hardworking nature, and her deep devotion to her mother, Carol Dodge. Her new apartment was an ordinary, modest space, representing a significant milestone in her journey toward personal independence and career development. On the evening of June 12, 1996, Angie spent time visiting with friends at her apartment, engaging in the routine, light-hearted conversations typical of teenagers enjoying the early weeks of summer. After her guests departed later that night, she locked her doors, completely unaware that a calculated and violent predator was actively monitoring her residence from the immediate neighborhood. The transition from a festive evening with friends to the absolute silence of the midnight hours marked the final moments of normalcy for Angie, as well as the beginning of a complex, decades-long legal nightmare for her family. The collective sense of safety in Idaho Falls shattered completely the following morning, on June 13, 1996, when friends arrived at the apartment and made a gruesome discovery. Angie was found dead in her bedroom, having been brutally sexually assaulted and stabbed multiple times in a frenzy of violence that left the entire room covered in physical evidence. Forensic investigators meticulously processed the crime scene, collecting a clean, viable male DNA profile from the biological material left behind by the true perpetrator. The handling detectives initially focused their attention on a group of local teenagers, eventually zeroing in on 20-year-old Christopher Tapp, a young acquaintance of Angie. Following hours of intense, highly coercive interrogation techniques that involved polygraph tests and promises of immunity, investigators extracted a detailed but deeply flawed confession from Tapp. Despite the glaring reality that Tapp's DNA did not match the biological profile recovered from Angie's body, the prosecution argued he had participated in the crime alongside an unidentified accomplice, and a jury found him guilty of murder and rape in 1998. Tapp was sentenced to life in prison, leaving the community under the false impression that justice had been served, while the true source of the DNA profile remained completely unidentified. For nearly 2 decades, Christopher Tapp languished in a maximum security prison while Angie's mother, Carol Dodge, began to deeply question the validity of the confession that had convicted him. Recognizing that the forensic DNA evidence pointed to a single, unidentified male who was still walking free, Carol launched a relentless crusade to uncover the truth, partnering with the Innocence Project to force a re-examination of the entire file. The investigation remained completely gridlocked until early 2019, when the Idaho Falls Police Department officially partnered with geneticist C.C. Moore of Parabon Nanolabs to utilize investigative genetic genealogy. The team uploaded the killer's preserved 1996 DNA profile to public, open-source ancestry databases, constructing a massive, multi-generational family tree based on distant biological cousins. After months of painstaking archival work, tracking public marriage certificates, obituary records, and historical census data, the genealogical search converged with absolute certainty on a single, highly specific target. The data pointed directly to Brian Leigh Dripps, a 53-year-old man who had been living an entirely unremarkable, law-abiding life in Caldwell, Idaho for more than 20 years. Shockingly, historical records revealed that at the time of the murder in 1996, Dripps had lived directly across the street from Angie Dodge on I Street, a detail that had been completely overlooked during the original, tunnel-visioned investigation. Undercover detectives immediately initiated a high-stakes surveillance operation, shadowing Dripps along his daily routine to secure a viable biological sample without alerting him to their presence. The definitive breakthrough occurred when detectives observed Dripps discard a cigarette butt outside his vehicle, which was immediately seized by the surveillance team and rushed to the state crime laboratory for hyper-urgent testing. The laboratory analysis delivered a stunning input, confirming that the DNA from the delivery driver's discarded cigarette perfectly mirrored the genetic profile recovered from Angie Dodge's bedroom 23 years prior. On May 15, 2019, investigators arrested Dripps and brought him into an interrogation room, where his decades of absolute anonymity completely collapsed under the weight of the scientific evidence. Confronted with the undeniable DNA match, Dripps confessed to acting alone, detailing how he had entered Angie's apartment under the cover of darkness to commit the assault and murder, completely exonerating Christopher Tapp. Brian Leigh Dripps officially pled guilty to first-degree murder and rape, and on June 8, 2021, he was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum 20-year non-parole period, ensuring he would spend the remainder of his natural life behind bars. Christopher Tapp was completely exonerated and released from prison, receiving a historic settlement from the city after spending over 20 years wrongfully incarcerated for a crime he did not commit. The resolution of the Angie Dodge case provided an immense sense of vindication for Carol Dodge, proving that true justice can only be achieved when law enforcement relies strictly on scientific certainty rather than forced human confessions. Yet, while Dripps hid his dark secrets behind the routine of an ordinary neighbor living across a suburban street, other predators utilized the vast, secluded parks of the Pacific Northwest to hunt down young children in broad daylight, leaving communities in a state of absolute, multi-generational paranoia. In March of 1986, the suburban city of Tacoma, Washington was a peaceful, community-oriented environment where families routinely utilized the region's vast public parks for recreation and outdoor gatherings. Nestled near the waters of the Puget Sound, the local neighborhoods were defined by a collective belief that their quiet residential areas were entirely safe for children to explore without constant parental supervision. 12-year-old Michelle Welch was a bright, deeply responsible girl who was widely known within her tight-knit family for her mature demeanor, her academic diligence, and her protective nature toward her two younger sisters. On the afternoon of March 26, 1986, Michelle took her younger sisters to Puget Park, a sprawling, heavily wooded nature area featuring hiking trails, gulches, and open playgrounds. The sisters were enjoying their time together when Michelle decided to ride her bicycle back to their grandmother's house nearby to pick up a paper bag lunch for the group. She pedaled away along the familiar neighborhood streets, her mind likely filled with ordinary thoughts of the sunny spring day and her weekend plans, completely insulated from any concept of personal danger. The short bicycle journey along the park perimeter marked the final moments of a normal childhood for Michelle, as well as the beginning of a 32-year nightmare that would completely paralyze the local population. The sense of security surrounding the children's afternoon evaporated entirely when Michelle failed to return to the park playground with the lunch, prompting her younger sisters to contact their mother after discovering her abandoned bicycle near the park entrance. Local police departments and hundreds of community volunteers immediately launched a massive, desperate search of the dense brush, ravines, and muddy trails that crisscrossed the expansive park terrain. The investigation took a dark and devastating turn late that evening when a tracking dog discovered Michelle's body, discarded in a secluded, heavily wooded ravine deep within the park, roughly a quarter-mile from the playground. Forensic pathologists determined that the young girl had been brutally sexually assaulted and killed by a combination of blunt, force trauma to her head and a severe neck wound, proving she had been the victim of a calculated, opportunistic predator. The absolute horror of the crime sent shockwaves through the city of Tacoma, transforming a popular public nature park into a place of intense public fear and paranoia, where parents strictly forbade their children from playing outside unattended. Forensic investigators meticulously processed the crime scene, collecting a clean, viable male DNA profile from the biological material left behind by the true perpetrator, which was carefully preserved in the state's evidence repository. Despite mobilizing a massive multi-agency task force, interviewing hundreds of known sex offenders, and chasing thousands of local leads, the police found themselves completely at a loss for a suspect, as the killer had managed to execute the attack and escape entirely unnoticed into the surrounding urban wilderness. For over 3 decades, the murder of Michelle Welch remained an open, agonizing wound for the residents of Tacoma and a deeply frustrating cold case for generations of local homicide detectives. The investigation was further complicated just 5 months later, in August of 1986, when another young Tacoma girl, 13-year-old Jennifer Bastian, vanished while riding her bicycle in a separate local park and was subsequently found murdered. For decades, law enforcement and the public operated under the logical assumption that a single, highly prolific serial child killer was stalking the public parks of Tacoma, a theory that severely complicated the distribution of investigative resources. The breakthrough that would completely redefine both investigations did not emerge from traditional police work or new witness statements, but from the implementation of advanced DNA sequencing and investigative genetic genealogy in early 2018. Investigators uploaded the distinct DNA profile recovered from Michelle's crime scene to public, open-source ancestry databases, allowing geneticists to bypass the traditional criminal justice system and map out the suspect's distant biological relatives through public family trees. To the complete shock of the investigative team, the genetic data revealed that the Welch and Bastian murders were committed by 2 entirely different, unrelated men who happened to strike the same city in the same year. The genealogical search for Michelle's killer converged with absolute mathematical certainty on a specific family line, narrowing the pool of potential suspects down to 2 brothers who had lived in the Tacoma area in 1986. Investigators focused their attention on Gary Charles Hartman, a 66-year-old community nurse who had spent the last 32 years living an entirely unremarkable, law-abiding life as a healthcare professional in the region. Hartman was the absolute antithesis of what the public imagined a child predator to be. He was an educated, quiet medical worker whose daily job involved caring for vulnerable patients and maintaining a professional, gentle demeanor. Detectives immediately placed Hartman under intense, round-the-clock surveillance, tracking his movements as he commuted between his home and his nursing shifts to secure a viable biological sample without alerting him to their presence. The breakthrough occurred in May of 2018, when undercover detectives followed Hartman and a colleague into a local commercial diner, where they sat at an adjacent table and watched his every movement. Detectives watched intently as Hartman consumed his meal and used a brown paper napkin, waiting patiently for the moment he finished his lunch and walked out of the establishment. The detective immediately seized the discarded paper napkin from the table, placing it in a secure evidence bag and rushing it to the Washington State Patrol Crime Laboratory for hyper-urgent genetic sequencing. The laboratory analysis delivered a stunning, definitive match, confirming that the DNA from the nurse's discarded diner napkin perfectly mirrored the genetic profile recovered from Michelle Welch's body 32 years prior. Scary Charles Hartman was arrested on June 20, 2018, during a routine traffic stop, bringing a sudden and shocking end to his decades of absolute anonymity within the very community where he had hunted. His trial, which took place in March of 2022 due to extensive pandemic-related delays, was a harrowing presentation of clinical forensic evidence, culminating in Hartman waiving his right to a jury trial and opting for a bench trial instead. The prosecution presented an airtight, fact-based narrative, demonstrating that the statistical probability of the DNA belonging to anyone other than Hartman was one in many quadrillions, completely dismantling any argument of contamination or coincidence. On March 22, 2022, the judge found Hartman guilty on all counts, including first-degree murder and first-degree rape, noting that the scientific evidence provided absolute certainty of guilt. On May 9, 2022, Hartman was officially sentenced to 26 years in prison, the maximum penalty allowed under the state's 1986 sentencing guidelines, ensuring that he would spend the remainder of his natural life behind bars for the childhood he destroyed. The resolution of the Michelle Welch case provided an immense sense of validation for her surviving sisters and a community that had carried the weight of that sunny afternoon for over 30 years. 10 distinct timelines, decades of cold silence, and hundreds of false leads all came to a definitive end, not through a stroke of luck, but through the absolute, unyielding precision of modern genetic science. These cases stand as historical proof that time is no longer a shield for the guilty, leaving us to wonder how many more phantoms are currently walking among us, entirely unaware that their past is about to catch up with them. Thank you for watching.